Hello my ghouls and goblins. Antarctica. We think of it as just a long stretch of desolate, cold, icy, frozen tundra, hauntingly isolated. But what if I told you it's exactly like that? It's no surprising how haunting a place this empty is. Grab a cup of something warm because you're gonna need it. This is the top 5 scary Antarctica urban legends you need to know. Urban legends? Rural legends, maybe more like. Is there anywhere urban in Antarctica? Anyway, let's dive on in. Number 5, Deception Island. There's a place in Antarctica called Deception Island, which does not even remotely sound like a place I would have any interest in visiting, because it sounds kind of evil, haunted, or at the very least intentionally misleading. Deception Island was once used as a whaling operation in the early 19th century, where whales were brought in to be harvested and processed, and as such, it's littered with the remains of the mighty creature's bones and carcasses. Unfortunately, in the early 19th century, Avatar: The Way of Water hadn't yet been released, so none of the whalers knew that whaling was bad, and they kept doing it. Maybe it's just the name, or maybe it's the reputation as an abandoned whaling station littered with macabre souvenirs of Earth's biggest mammal, but there have been all sorts of stories and rumors about Deception Island, that something or someone is still living there. Perhaps it's the spirit of the whales themselves. The whaling station was abandoned during the Great Depression and eventually found a new life, being repurposed as a British base during the Second World War. The station still stands alongside the vats where the whale fat was once burned, but it's all rusted over and lost to time. Recently, a paranormal investigation crew made the cold trek out to Deception Island to check out what the hubbub was about, and experienced all manner of suspicious activity. The crew noted that when they visited the island, immediately they could see light orbs all around them and see strange shadowy apparitions, and reported hearing strange voices speaking to them, but in a language that nobody could make out. It didn't sound like any modern language. Now, in some cultures, whales are considered very important animals, even some cultures considering them as sacred. Who is to say that a ghost could only manifest as human? And there's been reported stories of animal ghosts before, and considering how much suffering there must have been there and how profoundly emotional whales are, it does seem possible that the spirits of the whales are still calling out there to this day. And if you're looking for more scary urban legends, cryptids, aliens, and just about everything else freaky under the sun, baby, look no further. Top 5 Scary's got all you're looking for and then some. Take a click through, subscribe, and enjoy. Number 4, the ghost ship. Speaking of non-humanoid entities, let's talk about one of my absolute favorite dinner conversation topics: ghost ships. Back in the era of exploration, the South Pole was a treacherous pass, and countless explorers would sail their last expedition around the Antarctic. One such ship would be a schooner, the Jenny. Not much is known about the Jenny, the purpose of its original mission, or who was sailing on it. What we know of the Jenny mostly comes from when it was found, when it was discovered by a whaling ship in the year 1860. The whaling ship, the Hope, was sailing through when the spotter saw a battered, beaten, but somehow still sailing schooner passing narrowly through the gap between 2 icebergs. The crew of the Hope closed on in, looking to make contact, recognizing the English flag atop the mast, and assuming the ship was in grave danger. They sailed forward. There appeared to be 7 men standing on the deck, although they looked gravely underdressed for the weather. It wasn't until the Hope sailed close enough that the crew realized the men they were looking at on the Jenny weren't the crew, but nothing more than frozen remains. The men had been flash frozen solid, as if it had happened in an instant. They appeared to be in mostly good condition, not really showing signs of decomposition or anything. The Hope's captain, one Captain Brighton, boarded the Jenny to try and understand just what had happened. He went underneath the docks and found a man slumped over sitting on a barrel, a journal in his hands. Brighton went up to wake him, but immediately realized, like all of the others, he was frozen completely solid in place. He pried the journal out of his hands to read the last entry. May 4th. 1823. No food for 71 days. I am the last one still alive. If this log was to be believed, then that would mean the crew had been sailing as corpses aimlessly for decades, preserved as if not a day had passed. A real-life ghost ship. Captain Brighton took the journal with him to return it back home. Tragically, the wife of the Jenny's captain was found dead in the bedroom cabin alongside their dog. The Hope sailed off with nothing more than the journal in hand and left the Jenny idly floating across the frozen water, where she still may be to this day, or perhaps she's plunged deep beneath the icy water. Hopefully those men got to find some peace And oh man, I hope they found some food wherever they are. Number 3, the Terra ghosts. Back in the 19th century, everyone wanted to be that first crew to be able to get to the South Pole. The North Pole, we had that all figured out. We know all about Kris Kringle. But the South Pole was a land of opportunity and possibility. I guess we didn't know yet it was mostly just snow and ice and not much else. One Robert Falcon Scott, and wow, Falcon is a good middle name, was determined to be that first explorer to break boundaries. And in 1911, Robert Falcon Scott took a crew out on an expedition called the Terra Nova Expedition. The ship would make landfall a little later that year on the Ross Dependency, a nice little chunk of the frozen wasteland south of New Zealand. He and his team set up camp on the Great Ice Barrier, and while some crew would stay behind to look after the camp, find food and shelter, unloading sled dogs, ponies, and they built a hut with quilted insulation, while everybody else would venture forward to go towards that South Pole. However, things would not go quite as they had planned. You see, a rival explorer had already got to the South Pole about a month before Scott made it. One Roald Edmondson had already planted a black flag in the ice. Scott's crew were completely defeated and crestfallen, months and months of freezing labor, and they had absolutely nothing to show for it. History doesn't care about the second guy to get to the South Pole. A defeated Scott and the 4 men he took past the hut began a journey backwards, but it would prove treacherous. The men were already weak in spirits and started to fall to the elements. One by one, frostbite, gangrene, and starvation would take them. Scott would record one last journal entry in 1912. It's a bit harrowing, to be honest. Take a listen to this. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write any more. Signed, R. Scott. Last entry. And for God's sakes, look after our people. Like the rest of his crew, Scott would ultimately be taken by the Antarctic. Scott's hut still stands in the Antarctic to this day, and those who've been say they feel the unease standing there, as if there's something wrong in the air. And some have even gone so far as to say they felt like they could hear the voices, chattering teeth, and suffering of the men still freezing away from the cold all these years later. Number 2. Outpost 31. Working at a research station in Antarctica can't be easy. First of all, you gotta deal with the frozen conditions, being locked up with a bunch of other people for months at a time, isolated from the rest of the world, and being on one would be haunting enough without the threat of your coworkers going mad and attacking you. Take a listen to the story of Outpost 31, a now abandoned American research station where its entire crew went missing, presumed dead, and to date, no one really knows what happened. Outpost 31 was a research station located in, well, you guessed it, Antarctica, harboring 11 researchers, including one helicopter pilot, who were stationed there for the year of 1982. It was a fairly routine assignment, and all of the men involved were seasoned and no stranger to the conditions. A similar outpost maintained by a Norwegian research crew was the only sign of life nearby, which was also abandoned under similar circumstances. The only survivor seeming to be a wandering sled dog from the Norwegian station, which eventually made its way to Outpost 31 and was taken in by one Richard Clark, who was in charge of handling the sled dogs at Outpost 31. There isn't a whole lot of information available outside of a few diaries kept on computers from some of the researchers, but it was believed among the men that the dog they had brought in had been carrying some sort of foreign pathogen, some thing that had infected the men and their water and food supply, as shortly after this, there were reports of the men acting aggressive to each other, paranoid, distrusting, violent, and delusional. A log from the lead physician on the station showed that he had become so paranoid that this new novel virus they had let in would destroy the world if it breached containment, and the men had imposed themselves into a quarantine in an attempt to contain it, and eventually succumbed to madness. June 25th, 1982 was the last time anyone made any contact with Outpost 31. An SOS beacon was sent out, but when the rescue had arrived, they were shocked to discover smoldering remnants of the station. The outpost had been badly demolished, burnt, and several of the men had been found dead in brutal conditions, torn apart by wounds that didn't look like anything a human could have done. Some bodies were recovered, but concerningly, a majority of them had been completely lost with no signs whatsoever what had happened to them. But perhaps most bizarrely was the bodies found of the helicopter pilot and the chief mechanic, which were both found slumped over, frozen over, holding a bottle between them, suggesting the two men had accepted their fate and just waited for it to come. Number 1. The Ross Station crash. Now this might be hard to imagine since we tend to exclusively think of Antarctica as a barren wasteland inhabited exclusively by penguins, but at one point in time, it was actually a fairly popular destination for tourists to check out. Tourists would buy tickets for a day trip flight from New Zealand, would get treated to a delightful view of the barren frozen wasteland inhabited exclusively by penguins. It is kind of that. It was an exciting opportunity for people to get to see something that was previously thought unreachable. However, flights over Antarctica were not easy. The weather proves challenging, and visibility is very difficult, especially if there's any inclement weather. As well, because of the landscape, it can be very difficult for pilots to navigate with landmarks. Well, one such flight would suffer from all of these problems. It was 1979, and a flight carrying 257 passengers would be flying over Antarctica on a routine trip. Now, there were some issues. The crew staff in this particular flight were very inexperienced, and none of the pilots had ever flown along this flight path before. As well, data in the flight log was wrong, suggesting that there'd be okay visibility, but the day was plagued by low visibility. This, combined with the inexperienced pilots, made for a tragic combination, as the plane would crash into the side of Mount Erebus at 300 miles per hour, instantaneously ending the lives of every single person on the plane, all 257 of them. The remains of the passengers were taken to McMurdo Station, another American research station where they were cremated. Years onwards, researchers stationed at McMurdo have reported that they've heard strange things. Listen to this one report. As soon as I'd entered, I felt something was weird. I took a couple steps and the hair on top of my head stood on end. Footsteps upstairs where there shouldn't have been. Undeniably, there were footsteps above me. A slow cadence of footsteps. I froze up. Whew. Sends a chill down your spine, doesn't it? I should have been making spine chill puns this whole video. Well, that's it for this video, my ghouls and goblins. Thanks so much for creeping on. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.